Hello, everybody, and welcome back for our second panel this morning.
Siobhán, you're taking my spotlight. After you. Okay, I'll go. So the final panel, I can't believe we're at this stage already. We've talked about plays in many forms over yesterday and today, from play endings, what they mean, how long they last in your memory, to the production of plays and handing that script or that idea over to a team of creatives. We've talked about digital presentation, we've talked about publication, and in our last session we talked about the myriad ways in which work is documented. And now we come to an important and intriguing question, which is drawn from Veronica Coburn's essay, where she says, "It was a show without words. A play script exists." This is going to be a very interesting conversation, which is going to be moderated by Siobhán, and I will allow her to introduce the guests, who are Marc Mac Lochlainn, Newell and Emma Martin.
Hi, guys. I'm delighted you're able to be with us this morning. I'm going to introduce our three panelists before posing my first question. So, Anna Newell is a leading theatre maker working in the area of theatre for young audiences. She makes work for babies, early years, and children with complex needs. Marc Mac Lochlainn is artistic director of Branner Théâtre de Poche, which he founded 20 years ago, working in the medium of Irish. And Emma Martin is a dancer and choreographer, established the United Fall in 2018 and has had a recent big hit with her show, Night Dances. So welcome, guys. I'm delighted you're able to come in on this conversation this morning. I thought I might start by asking each of you to give us like an initial reaction to the provocation. And also, if you wouldn't mind, you might just share with us what was the first piece of theatre or first show you saw. So I might start with Marc.
Thanks so much, and it's lovely to be here today, and hello to my fellow panelists. So I'll start with the first piece of theatre that I saw, and like I think that I came to theatre very late, and the first time I ever stood on stage was when I was in university, and I think the first piece of theatre I ever saw was an amateur production of an O'Casey play in Prosperous, I think, in County Kildare, when I was doing my leaving cert, and it didn't stay with me, I needless to say. But it was it's interesting to think about it now as you know, the first time I was exposed to theatre, and probably one of the reasons I wanted to make work for children is that it was because you know the children deserve to experience art as much as adults do, in response, I really enjoyed Veronica's essay, and because it resonated with me. The idea that a piece of theatre is made, there is a document always for that piece of theatre, and say for example, with pieces that we would make with that have no language and that are puppet pieces, it would almost be like the old style. Do you ever see the old style theatre scripts from the Abbey or for the Tithe that they couldn't afford to have a script with everybody's pieces in it, so you only get your own script. So you get the line that comes into you, and then you get your own script. And it would be kind of like that, because each of the performers have their own internal script for those moments that they have to perform with the puppet or for the puppet. So I think that there's quite a detailed document that goes with each of the shows.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'll come back to you about that point about how each person having just their bit of the story, as it were. So Emma, maybe you might tell us your initial reaction to the provocation.
My initial reaction, hi Siobhán, and thanks for having me. This is lovely opportunity to talk about this topic. My initial reaction was that a play script exists. It was a show of no words that, oh, there should be a play script to justify having no words. And then when I thought about it a little bit more, I thought, well, we use so many words to create and so many words to communicate with the performers that that could become the play script.
Mm.
And that's what is then translated into whatever form.
Mm.
So I chilled out about then, and I didn't feel like it was a justification anymore.
Yeah.
And then my first piece of theatre that I saw, I think, was probably Lambert's Puppet Theatre when I was a kid. And then the next thing that I saw was my brother performing in a transition year show of Julius Caesar. They're my earliest memories of seeing it.
And the first dance piece for you, what was the first dance piece you saw? As a matter of interest.
The dance piece I saw was probably my mom brought me to see the Bolshoi Ballet.
All right.
So it was sort of, yeah, big treat, big scale, start with a bang. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Emma. And Anna. Oh, I think maybe you're on. Yeah, thank you, Anna.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
I remember the first piece of theatre that I saw, which I think might partly be a result of my age, but also because it just felt like it was always around. I do remember the first piece of theatre that I made, which was when I was about 8, and I made a piece called The Frog in the Well, and I made all my friends be in it with me, and I also played the frog, which was less about megalomania and more about the fact that nobody else wanted to be painted green and be down the well for the entire show. This whole notion about a play script existing, I'm sort of very much with Emma on that one. I mean, one of the things about my extraordinary audiences is that they generally have little or no verbal communication, so it's probably not surprising that the collaborative teams that I bring together, who are often really interdisciplinary artists, reach elsewhere for theatrical languages to engage our audiences. And I guess the other thing is that in terms of sort of the notion of authorship, and it almost always being my catalyzing and leading a kind of collaborative journey with a bunch of different artists, whether that's choreographers, designers, video artists. Many of the shows that I make have a dramaturgical structure which itself has an openness of possibilities, and it creates a situation where the audience members have genuine agency, so no show is ever the same. But I think because it's so much made in the moment, in some ways it almost makes it even more ephemeral than the kind of fleeting collective moment of live theatre for adults. And I guess practically, as I imagine Emma and Marc do as well, and pragmatically, I use a range of ways to kind of gather the material of the show as much as anything else to keep it in my mind for future times, whether that's video or a script of actions, a musical score, sometimes even, and I don't really know what I mean by this phrase, a script of meaning, which looks a bit sometimes like a poem or the text from a children's book.
So just picking up on that point from Anna there, Marc, that whole notion of authorship and how you document the authorship. What do you do in Branagh?
Well, I suppose it depends on the piece and it depends on the entry point. So we try and find different ways in every time to keep the process interesting for ourselves. So sometimes it might be an image from an illustrated book. Sometimes it might be a book. Sometimes it might be an event in history, and we will kind of spend, so I suppose the period is elongated, so we'll spend time researching it, and everybody that's in the room has input into it, but we generally it will be devised by the company, or it will be something where I will go and write a script based on what we're working on, and then we'll take it from there. Interestingly, at the moment, for the first time ever, we're working with Christian O'Reilly, and we're going to have a script to see what that's like, because it's a new way in as well for us. So I suppose when it's in terms of the process, like Anna said, I suppose when everybody's involved, when you have a bunch of creatives in the room, and everybody's input is valid, and nobody is precious about those ideas, then you can genuinely say that it's kind of devised by the company. So I suppose that's how we would approach it. And then if there is text, then it's whatever works is written down and repeated. So it's never really, nobody ever says, like, if there's like Ruher, the recent show we had has 7 words in it, and nobody claims a word. Some people say them, but nobody claims who came up with it for that point in the show, you know.
And Emma, what is it for you around authorship and documenting the authorship? I mean, maybe as a choreographer it's different, but anyway.
Yeah. I suppose in terms of overall authorship, the concept of something would, come from me, and from that, then I would gather the team together. But then the actual writing of the choreography is always in collaboration with the dancers, because the dancers are then, and the designers and composers, sound designers, they're all brought in for what I have seen of them already, or because what I know of them and what they might bring to it. So their own authentic way of moving, or authentic way of interacting with the concept becomes very important then. So it becomes sort of co-authored with the team and with each dancer. So yeah, it's a funny one, because you can't, I mean, obviously the ideas come from you, and you're bringing people into that space, into that world and universe, and then asking them to put that into their own creative spirit and bodies. And figuring out what that means to them.
And Anna, all your works are authored by you, isn't that right?
What I tend to say created by, and then as the kind of, very similar to Emma in terms of come up with the idea, who makes the frame, who invites people into that frame, and then I talk about the individual things that people bring to that soup that's swirling around, that the language emerges from, whether that's design. And the other thing that I often say is I talk about that it's been developed in creative consultation with, and that can be a particular school, or that can be babies and parents, because we would, particularly the work that I make for babies or children and young people with complex needs, we would have audience members in from about day 3 of rehearsal. And it's kind of more than simply giving feedback. It sort of directly informs and inspires the direction that it takes. And as I was saying earlier, we create a kind of quite a rigid, quite a solid dramaturgical structure, but within that, everything is nuanced. Everything is, the performers have like, for example, the dance piece that I made recently, they had a set of physical languages that they and the choreographer and myself had devised together, that they had at their disposal to engage the audience in conversation. I'm really aware that I'm using lots of words that are about language. Which I think which I think is crucial, even though I think in the last 5 years I've made one show that has any words in it at all.
But that's an interesting point that you're talking about, using language a lot. because at the previous session, sorry, the first session this morning, on the panel on plays and play reading and play publishing, I thought John O'Donovan made a really interesting comment, which I'm actually going to share. And he was talking about on a play script or a play text, because just as an aside, Veronica later on in her essays, she puts aside the notion of scripts and she talks about the play text. So John then this morning was talking about the tension or the kind of playfulness between the dialogue on the page and the stage direction. And he was really advocating, or at least I interpret he was advocating, the importance of keeping your stage directions, not to put a iron grid over the production or the play, but as a way of literally talking about purpose and intention, what you wanted to see achieved. But what his line was the purpose of stage directions, and this is what he said was, purpose of stage directions was to give you a sense of what are the bodies doing around the words. So, Mark, just in terms of capturing a text, like, isn't that interesting, that idea? So you wouldn't be so concerned about capturing the 7 words in your show, but what the bodies were doing. And I'm wondering, is that what you do? Or do you rely on video to capture that? Or do you actually ever make an attempt to capture in words what the bodies are doing, whether they're puppets or dancers or actors? Yeah.
I suppose, you see, you have to come at it from the point of view of how important is language to it in the first place. And for me, it depends on what way we want to tell that story. And a lot of the times when we are making work, language is just an extra layer, and it's a signpost. And it's if we use a sentence, it's to help the audience along the way with what we're doing, or if we use any text at all. But I suppose the movement, the music, the imagery is paramount, and the language just sits it's equal to all of those layers. And the only way that we can really document it for further, for archive purposes would be with video. But then video itself, unless it's filmed in a really nice way, is not going to give you what it feels like to be in that room watching that piece. So like we will constantly take images of things. We take lots of notes. We try and the best, I think the guys will agree, when you go to remount a piece, the best memory is the muscle memory of the performers. If you have the same people back and you have the same set, they'll remember, the body will remember what they were doing, and the words will follow. So I think that I suppose we never really place that sort of value on the language. It's not the thing we move around. The way we want to tell the story is how we is the thing that's important, the story or the imagery that delivers that. But if the words are helpful, then that's great. So that's the way I would look at that. It's kind of what angle you take, how important where you place the words within the piece.
What do you think, Emma?
Yeah, I suppose video is the most obvious, but then you find you often look back on video and you go, oh, but what was the intention of that? And what I found I end up doing during creative processes, I might have an idea, sort of outline of small sections, or what Anna, I think you said, a script of meaning. And then you flesh that out in rehearsal, and you flesh out and you take notes and you write down, oh yeah, this was about, reaching beyond the walls, or reaching, into the vast space of the whatever, and those kind of things then remind you about the intention. And if you were to ever do it again, then, that can be brought back in, and because something is lost if it's just about the physical map, or it's just about the sort of initial idea, because it becomes so rich within the process that it needs to be brought back and regrown in a way each time it's done again. So notebooks become very valuable.
What are your thoughts, Anna?
Yeah, it is. Similarly, it's about layers of stuff. It is, shows are completely sung, which they often are. We have a musical score, and use video a lot, but it's often about trying to retain notes of, well, what are the feelings that we're trying to create at this moment? What are the possibilities for connection with our audience that we discovered in the journey, not simply of just making the show, but actually of 8 weeks of touring it? What are the things that we discovered that we didn't want to happen? And I think one of the things is that kind of comes up, I think, is that what are we documenting for? And what I'm mostly documenting for is so I can remember. If I go to make it again, I don't think, I think there are some elements of some of the video stuff that we've created that attempt to capture and communicate a flavour of what the thing was, and then sometimes it's a combination of again layers of responses from parents, from teachers, but in terms of documenting for posterity, for me, and I don't know if this is too off track, there's actually a way, and it's something that I caught the end of the last discussion, and it sort of implied a really similar thing for a piece for adult audiences. I think there is a way that these things are documented more radically. For me, specifically with the work that I make for babies, one of the things that people often say to me is, what's the point? What's the point? They're not going to remember. But actually and I do rant on about this endlessly, but the neuroscience shows us that we are born with brains that aren't fully formed, and that our brains grow more than they ever do in the first 3 years of our life, and that the things that happen in the first 3 years of our life have an actual direct and lasting impact on how those brains are formed. And loads of the research about that is about adverse experiences, but the converse is also true. So hopefully, the lyrical, magical, connective experiences of the arts are documented in a tiny, tiny way by being written into their brains.
Well, that's a really interesting idea. And I think let that percolate for a minute now, and maybe come back to that in a second. Because, Mark, I wanted to ask you about something that is kind of fundamental to the Playography project, which was that 20 years ago when we started this, we thought we'll gather all these plays, all the contemporary work that's made, all the new work. We'll have all the rights information available, and we'll have all the publication information available. And therefore, these plays can be, the repertoire can be revitalized. Other makers will go back and look at that work, and they'll look to restaging it. Has any of the work you've made in the last 20 years been then subsequently done by other companies and other makers? I'd like to ask all three of you that, actually, about that whole thing, which would have been part very much of the play tradition. You wrote the play, it was published, and then its further life involved the selling of licenses for further productions. So just be really interested to know, has somebody else done your work? And is that something you're interested in?
No, nobody has done it. And I don't know, is it something that like some of the work that some of the earlier stuff that we've done, or some of the pieces that have like more traditional type scripts would possibly lend themselves to being recreated by another company or another bunch of artists. But no, the closest we've got is kind of the possibility of going over maybe to China and making a show with another group of performers, so that they could do that piece. But no, it hasn't worked in that way. No.
Yeah, but that idea actually of the kind of touring the concept, I actually think is the future of touring. I think the notion of shows going on the road and all the stuff and all the people is kind of over or on its way out. And for the sake of the environment, I think we'll be touring the concept, and I think the artists and the makers will go to places with their concept and their ideas, and that's the kind of touring. But anyway, sorry, I digress. I come back to ask you then, Emma, about that sense of like I know in modern classical ballet, as it were, I think that work is done, reproduced. So I suppose I'm interested for a contemporary maker. Would there be any sense that your work would be done by others, and what would you need in order for it to be done by others?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about that as well. How, you know, how work could tour, and as you said, I think that's the future. But that hasn't happened with my work so far, and I guess yeah, I'd be really interested in it, but I suppose there's something about the question of the aboutness of dance, you know, like what is the dance about? And for it to stay alive, there's something about it, maybe if you were to put it onto another cast or into another company, of it maybe staying live with a kind of a for, so the dance is for something, so it can continue to be relevant to other groups. Because there's something, I don't know, once dance is performed, something is already given away, you know, with each performance, and it's quite an intangible thing, and I don't know. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I do, yeah. But
not a static kind of.
Yeah. But then I'm also thinking that for a lot of choreographers, as for a lot of theatre makers, the work stays in your repertoire. So if you're still working at 80, you could be revisiting those works that you made at 22 or 20, whatever, and have them live in that sense in your repertoire. And people would be coming to see, you know, the Emma Martin dance, you know, all those years later, which would be still either true to the first version or a version of it.
Yeah.
So
that would be the dream, of course.
Yeah, that's going to be your legacy, or not? Well, you'll still be alive. You still be active. I mean, not alive. You still be active. You still be a maker. Yeah. And Anna, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm in a really similar position to Mark in that it feel like the model that's happening. I've been asked both from the UK and from Canada about a kind of model where you take work and you ignite interest, and then you make work that remains there. But the other thing for me is that the audiences that I'm making work for, it's still to a certain extent, even globally, a kind of emerging art form. So, for example, I was lucky enough a few years ago, I was invited over to South Africa to work with a company there to help them create the very first baby theatre in South Africa. So for me, it's about igniting the possibilities. And I think that is one of the things that I'm starting to think about, which, you know, reflects from what you were saying just then, is about looking at a model that's personally sustainable. You know, and I am moving forward, I'm really interested in looking at, which I've done to a certain extent, but I want to do more, representing existing work. As much as anything else, my audiences very quickly grow up and they keep coming into the world. And my other audiences, kids with complex needs, we found that actually the familiarity of a piece that they've experienced before really enhances their experience of it. So yeah, that's that. And as I said, you know, I think for me, every single time we do the piece or a piece, it's different because it is deliberately created in a way where it changes every single time in direct response to its audience members. So it is ultimately ephemeral in that way, but for me it's about igniting the possibilities of that kind of work for those underserved audiences elsewhere.
And Mark, how much of your work is actually in the repertoire, in your repertoire? I mean, are you always making a new show?
There's always, yes, but it might be that there is we have a piece that we made in 2012 that's still being performed in Denmark, because our partners kept it alive. So like it does stay in the repertoire. It do and like How to Catch a Star is possibly is going on tour next year, and it was made in 2017. So shows depend, and especially when they have an international life, it means that it's a longer life, but it has more breaks between it, you know. So but we will, you know, we try and make a new one and have 2 or 3 ready in process, and then 1 or 2 that could possibly be touring ahead of us, you know. So that's how we do it. But I think that, like what the guys are saying, that a lot of the work that we would make, because of the nature of the process and the intimate kind of nature of the room and the people that are involved, the shows are very personal to those casts, and it's hard to put a new person into that cast, or it's hard to put a new performer into a specific role, because the roles in a sense are developed by the people who are making them. And it in some sense, it's like if you have a puppet that doesn't talk, it's rude to talk over it. It's because sometimes it feels rude to put somebody new into a piece, because of the fact that piece is basically a very personal thing to that group, you know. So there is that kind of issue, I think, as well with the work that we make.
Yeah, and just because that was another point raised in Veronica's article, was the whole thing around, in the early days of Barabbas, you know, the time spent in devising the shows, and then equally very early on bringing clarity around ownership in terms of the devising nature of it, and the copyright. And is that something you've done in Branagh as well? Did you do it more recently, or did you do it actually at the beginning? Did you set it up in that way, as she kind of implies they did in Barabbas?
Well, we kind of there's always been those conversations that at the beginning that everybody's input is valued, and I think that way of describing of created by the company is the way to acknowledge everybody's input into it, and we kind of look at it in that way. But latterly, I suppose, and everybody's encountered this, but to be with digital rights and to try and figure out the proper way to acknowledge everybody's input into a piece when it becomes a digital piece, as opposed to it being a piece that's put on stage, and that's what we initially started to do. You know, so it's all new, but I suppose the thing is, once you respect everybody's input and acknowledge their input, I think that's a good beginning point, you know.
Yeah. And how would that be for you, Emma?
Yeah, similar to Marc, in that, you know, in the crediting, it's in collaboration with, and I suppose, you know, with Barabbas, maybe because the 3 members of Barabbas were performing and creating it together, you know, then that's maybe a different task of having to clarify that in the beginning. Whereas, with my work, it's just known that the collaborative element will be said.
And for you, Anna, it's all yours. Are you similar? You got your devisers and collaborators?
As I say, I would credit myself with created by, because it tends to be my concept, and it tends to be myself kind of at the center. But as I say, I would then credit people with what they bring towards the theatrical language that we're using, whether it's choreographed by, composed by. So kind of really specific credits in terms of that. And a structure of repeat fees, being pragmatic as well. Right. And as I say, the recognition of the creative consultation with the audience.
Yeah, we won't go into the digital rights thing, Marc, because I think, you know, for all of us, that's something we're still working out. But I'd be really interested to know that, you know, the second half of the title of the symposium was something like a discussion about non-verbal theatre in a historically literary tradition. So so this question just is, you know, and forgive me if I'm asking a very old-fashioned question, but when you come to your storytelling, are you still in storytelling terms, we're getting about the words around it, in storytelling terms, is it still beginning, middle and end, the kind of 3 act story? Is that really what's hidden, hidden? And I'm going to mention, somebody was mentioned yesterday a lot, Aristotle and his Poetics. Are we still, as human beings, we're literally programmed in 3s, and the brain wants the passion of 3. Please deliver 3. If you say something twice, give it to me a third time. If you do a movement twice, give it to me a third time. My brain wants it. I want that conclusion. Yeah. It's like Tito in music. You need it to be resolved. So what do you think about that?
I think that we have a luxury in that we have an audience that are open and receptive to whatever magic is put before them, and that if they don't expect something to be a certain way, and so therefore there is that luxury to be playful as creators and to play with those forms, if you like, of traditional theatre. I would say that if we what I love is when we make a piece that has no words in it, what you're offering the audience then is a chance for them to be creating their own internal narrative, and it'll be completely different to what's happening with the person beside them. And they're experiencing the show for themselves, and also creating their own narrative. And it's our job, I suppose, as directors of the piece, to ensure that we don't put them off by a wrong move, or a puppet looking the wrong way, or losing focus, or a performer just taking a breath at the wrong time. And that it's quite a delicate process, but when it works, it's something that's really, really magical, because you have the audience experiencing their own imagination while being inspired by the imagination and the creativity of the performers in front of them. And sometimes I feel like words get in the way of that. So especially with younger audiences, if you start to put in words, and I suppose what started all of this with Branner was we were working through Irish, and I couldn't assume that my audience spoke that language. So what we decided to do was we removed the language completely and tried to learn that craft of making stuff in silence. And then once we put our language back in, it became a layer, and we used as many languages as possible. So we would quite often use Catalan and Spanish or French or whatever language the performers have. And it seems to kind of increase the magic or the imagination of the pieces. So I think that there is a certain thing in humans that we need to find a narrative. We will, like, especially if you do pieces for babies, the babies will experience it in the now, and then they'll go, and now what's next, and now. But the adults are kind of going, I'm wondering what's the connection there. And children don't really care about the history of the character. They want to know, they want that character to be with them there at that moment. So that freedom for us allows us to be really, really imaginative and creative with the way in which we present pieces. But there still is that that beginning, the middle, and the end in some way. It might be a little bit blurred, but it still is there. And because they are humans in front of us, no matter what age they are, and people enjoy a story being resolved. Or
do you have those concerns, thoughts, issues when you're making work in dance?
Yeah, I'm thinking about all that, and I'm kind of going, yes. I definitely have made work that does fit into that mold, and then work that maybe follows more of an energetic arc of a beginning, middle, and an end. Yeah. But I think really we're not so literate in dance, and we're very literate in story. And maybe that's not just Ireland, but certainly in Ireland, dance has kind of bet itself into this theatrical play model. Yeah. In a way that, is more trusted. It's reliable. There's words. It's kind of weighted down by that. And sometimes, dance is seen as this thing that that isn't it doesn't have this solid foundation on it. And there's too many meanings to be taken from it, and there's too many possibilities, and we want to know and we want to understand, you know. So at the moment, you know, I'm sort of flying the flag for dance taking itself out of that
dance theatre world. Yeah.
You know, and maybe not having to rely so much on story. On linearity.
And Anna, could you briefly give us your sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that notion of, you know, our historically literary tradition is that I think about a lot, because I think it can sometimes lead to narrower ideas of what story is, of what narrative is, of what dramaturgy is. And I think that's changing for adult audiences to a certain extent. But what I found really interesting, I'm doing huge amounts of mentoring over the last year with emerging theatre makers and even people who work in other less literary art forms. And it's been really interesting and slightly frustrating to me that sometimes their kind of go-to of what's needed for younger audiences should consist of a storyteller narrating a story and then the story being acted out.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, as an artist, what really excites me about these audiences is the potential, as Marc was saying, to expand and explode notions of story and narrative, form and content. I wrote down when I was reading one of the essays, Thomas Kilroy's phrase, exciting the curiosity of an audience. And I think it's that, but I think it's supercharged. And in the same way that Emma's saying, like the story or the narrative could be about an energetic arc. For me, because of the responsive nature of the show, often for me, the story or the narrative of the show is about the story of the relationship that the performer is building with the audience, and the how expansive things get, how big, how loud, how extraordinary, how euphoric that journey can be, and then how the audience is brought home, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, my dear panelists, oh sorry, Emma, did you want to jump in?
I just wanted to quickly add that in some ways, you know, I always come back to the idea that, you know, before we had words, we had dance.
Yeah.
Yes.
And in some ways, you know, words feel very concrete and quite masculine and like the Apollo side, you know.
Yeah, sure.
It's logic driven. And there's just something about that maybe dichotomy of, you know, this sort of very logic-led world that we exist in.
I have to interject now and say, I think at this point, the four of us could probably spend hours talking about this, because this is where we're really getting into a really meaty part of the conversation. And I hope we have incited the curiosity of the audience who are with us on the session now. I need to thank you all very much, Emma, Anna and Marc, for this fabulous contribution, and I hope we get to pick up this conversation at another point. And I need to hand us back, I think, to Jane and the team, and apologise, guys, for going over a few minutes, but I think it was actually very, very interesting. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Siobhán.